Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's Diverse Talk Live. Just give folks a few seconds here to get into our Zoom room. Great. Again, welcome. Thanks again for joining this Diverse Talk Live, meeting the mental health needs of minority college students. My name's Wendy, and I will be your host for this session. Just a few housekeeping items up front here. All participants are in a listen-only mode, and we will have a Q&A session after the formal discussion, and you can type questions at any time in that Q&A panel found in your Zoom window. If you're on your PC, it'll be at the bottom of your Zoom window there. So feel free to type questions at any time. You will only see your own questions, so to let you know that. And again, we thank you very much for joining today's session. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to today's moderator, is David Pluvios, Executive Director here at Diverse. So welcome, David. The floor is yours.
Wendy, thank you so very much. And I wanted to thank everybody who has joined us for what will be a packed hour of very relevant discussion when it comes to minority college students and mental health. We all know that this COVID-19 pandemic has been very stressful on all of us, but the transition to college life and navigating college life is a time of extraordinary stress. And so colleges, we know, are hard pressed to figure out how best to support the mental health needs of all students. But we know that in particular, minority students on the margins are most vulnerable in so many different ways. And so at this time, I just want to give a quick introduction to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. We have three experts today who I believe will be able to, from their commentary, will be able to come away with a number of outstanding best practices. First, I'd like to introduce Nahed Barakat. Dr. Barakat, she's a licensed clinical psychologist and also interim training director, coordinator of diversity and inclusion initiatives at the University of Denver in their health and counseling center. Nahed, thank you so much for joining us. Next, I would like to introduce Nathan Demers. Dr. Demers is Vice President of Clinical Programs and Strategic Partnerships, and he's also a licensed clinical psychologist with you at college. And Nathan, thank you so much for being here today. And last but not least, Amy Gatto. Amy is Senior Manager of Higher Ed and Evaluation for Active Minds. And as you all may know, Active Minds has been a key player in spreading awareness and best practices with regards to college students and mental health. Amy, thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to go ahead and start us right off with my first question, and it's a question for all of our panelists. And I'll start with Nahed. I was wondering if you could talk about how you first began working with college students and how your work has particularly impacted colleges and the students that they serve. Nahed, can you go ahead, please?
Yes, thank you, David. So when I was still in graduate school working on my doctorate, part of our training required us to go to these different field site placements to work with different populations and figure out what we want to do. And so I kind of chose college populations because I figured that this is a very important transitional time for a lot of students where, you know, it's the first time maybe for a lot of people leaving their family's house and being adults on their own. And also trying to make it in college. And so recognizing the mental health impact that may have on people just felt very important to me. And, you know, as a student of color myself, and I was also an international student at the University of Denver at the time, just recognize that there are a lot of missed opportunities for students of color to gain more support because either, you know, there's stigma around mental health issues, or there is not a lot of knowledge about resources, and maybe this expectation that the students are going to go and try to find the resources themselves. So part of my jobs, which I've worked at a lot of different universities around the state of Colorado, was really going to the students and really sharing the resources with them instead of the expectation of them to come to us.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. I thought I was wondering if you talk a little bit about how you got into the work, specifically focusing on meeting the mental health needs of college students.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So similar to Nahed, during my rotations, I sort of always knew and had an interest in college populations, largely based on my own college experience and knowing developmentally, it's both a vulnerable time, but a huge time of opportunity. And I wrote my dissertation actually on the construct of maturity. And throughout my career, I've really focused on the positive psychology movement. And just to explain that a little bit, mental health has often adopted this mentality of we wait till something's wrong and then we try and treat it. And I think we can do a lot better than that. How do we identify individuals who can benefit from additional coping strategies, connecting to resources like Nahed said, and things like that? So that's actually how I went from being a traditional clinician to actually working on the technology side of things, knowing that we can have great reach and impact. And specifically, a lot of students from historically marginalized communities don't feel like traditional supports on campus are made for them. So digital gives them the opportunity to connect confidentially, anonymously, and really break down a lot of barriers.
Good, that's good. Thank you so much. Amy, I was wondering if you could also talk about how you got into this work, focusing on the mental health needs of college students.
Good question. So my experience is a little different. My background is public health. And so I began working on a college campus, working on alcohol and other drug coordination. And in that position, I recognized the overlap between mental health needs and alcohol and other drug support. And so I just became really ingrained in the campus community, eventually becoming more responsible for projects related to college student mental health. Eventually moving into a research position, looking at college student mental health needs specifically for male undergraduate and graduate students from a public health approach. So what can we do for primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention? Going to Nathan's idea of positive psychology, public health is similar. What can we do upstream to prevent us just from treating students when they are in crisis or have high levels of need? And from there, college campuses are kind of a microcosm of some of the other systems that we operate in. And there's so many unique needs for students on campuses, students with diverse identities. Most of my background in research was, again, on male college students. We know that they're less likely to seek professional help. And so what can we do on campuses to encourage help seeking amongst a wide variety of student groups? Since then, I've transitioned to Active Minds, which does this on a national level, supporting K through 12, higher ed, and communities to address mental health needs for individuals in order to decrease any stigma and essentially change the conversation about mental health to make things more inclusive and to make people's experiences more positive.
Thank you so much, Amy. One question that comes to mind from the top of our panel discussion is, where does the responsibility end for higher ed institutions? Because the reality is that there are so many needs that so many students come to college with. And some may argue, hey, we are an educational institution. Ultimately, when it comes to things like social services, when it comes to things like counseling, there's only so much responsibility that we have as higher ed institutions to be able to service that need. Nathan, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the messaging that you have had with institutions and those who are responsible for student services when it comes to what structures are necessary when it comes to making sure that vulnerable students don't fall through the cracks. What is the responsibility in your view of higher ed institutions when it comes to meeting mental health needs of their students.
And David, did you want me to kick that off?
Yeah, please, Nathan.
Sure, I'm happy to. And then Nahed, I'd love your perspectives being on a campus as well. But from my perspective, when we look at the mission of institutions and you read through, prospective student packets, it's so clear that all of the messaging really doesn't just focus on education. What we're selling in higher education is much more than just, book smarts. We're talking and teaching people of how to think, how to interact, how to support others, how to be global citizens. And maintaining mental health and well-being is essential in that mission. I don't think it's something that can be pulled apart from the core message or the core role of higher education. 18 to 24, or even for non-traditional students, that's really where students are differentiating. They're becoming individuals and figuring out who they want to be, what they want to be, and ideally finding their purpose and what sort of mark they want to make on the world. And if I'm slipping between the cracks, if I'm coping with anxiety, depression, or I'm the victim of microaggressions or discrimination, it's obviously going to make it very hard for me to focus on those much larger goals. So I do think it's an institutional responsibility to make sure that we're supporting holistic well-being and mental health.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think college health has changed over the years. I think in the past, it used to be more that, you kind of deal with adjustment issues that just kind of students are really having a hard time adjusting to coming to college. But what we've been seeing is an upward trend of mental health issues that are on the rise because of things like systemic oppression, things like, a pandemic, and just kind of a lot of pressure being put on the students. And so I agree with Nathan that, the idea of a college campus is that, we provide housing, we provide activities, it's not only education. But I think where our role ends, or where our responsibility may end, is recognizing our limitations also, right? So maybe we are not a huge counseling center, but we're serving the entire university. So we're not offering maybe as consistent of therapy as we would like. So if we see somebody in need of a higher level of care, it is our responsibility to say, hey, what you're coming in with is not something that I can help you with right now. And these are the resources out in the community. And I need to see that through, right? I need to see that referral through to make sure that this person is situated with somebody that is going to be helpful for them. But yeah, I definitely don't want to be like, yeah, sorry, this is too much. I'm not dealing with it. So it's going back to what I said earlier about helping the students find resources of, okay, well, you're going to graduate at some point. So how do you personally go about finding that for yourself as well?
To add to this, when we think about institutional investment and opportunity, if you look at a lot of the work from the Healthy Minds Network and their return on investment calculations. So, in higher ed, a lot of what we have to think about is what services are we providing to the students now? What should we be providing? What's within our means? But also, what does that mean for us long term? Where are students going as alums into the workforce? And when we actually look at the economic model, the return on investment for institutions, by investing in student mental health, we're seeing increased retention and persistence. These hot buzzwords in higher ed: improved student success outcomes, so connections to belonging on a college campus, the idea of flourishing. And we're seeing increased donations and involvement over time, right? And so when students are retained, they're contributing their tuition dollars to our institutions. When students are, donating over time, again, financially, like if you look at the return on investment, there are huge dividends that come from addressing student mental health. And exactly what Nathan was saying, when you look at these brochures, you're not just looking at pictures of Zoom classrooms and economics textbooks, right? You see students walking down the quad, conversations about where people eat on campus. The whole field of student affairs is involved in the student experience. And one part of that is supporting student mental health.
David, if you don't mind, I'd love to add one additional thing that both Nahed and Amy's thoughts made me think of. When we look at rates of anxiety, depression in high school, acute suicidality, substance use, and we also look at it in college, they are drastically on the rise. And of course, most significantly, we know that suicide is the second leading cause of death on college campuses, which in my opinion is tragic, heartbreaking, and totally unacceptable. But just like we see, our society rallying against vaping and, things aimed at target populations that lead to very significant negative health outcomes, I think as a society, we should be just as responsive when it comes to mental health. And we're seeing that more and more students are entering higher education with needs when it needs related to anxiety, depression, and other clinical diagnoses. So we need to be responsive to our students who are coming in and paying high tuition amounts to be members of our communities.
When we think about the different institutional profiles that are represented, for instance, among diverse readers, of course, there are community colleges. There are minority served institutions. There are large land grants. But among all these different institutional types, what is consistent is clearly the need to both identify crises before they happen when it comes to mental health, and to provide some solutions, some resources to help their students, whoever they are. And of course, we're talking about students on the margin, minority students in particular in this particular discussion. And I wanted to ask you, what mix of supports do you think is ideal, talking generally? Because of course, Nathan mentioned technology, as of course we know with chatbots and different other technological platforms that can deliver mental health care. Technology has come into play, but you also have a need for talk therapy. Might have a need for psychiatrists who can actually prescribe medication. There are so many different resources, and I think Amy spoke to the point that there is a clear return on investment in the resources that institutions pour into mental health care. But the question for you, I want to ask you on ahead, what mix of supports do you think should colleges aim for as they look to get the most out of their investment in mental health care?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I think about a college campus is it's like a village or a small town, right? We can't only focus on student needs from one aspect. We kind of have to have eyes on students from all different aspects, right? Whether it be in therapy, in the classroom, socially, in activities, and anything, in any place that the student shows up, right? And so, our limitation as therapists is that we're bound by HIPAA. So we can't really share information with anyone else that besides our counseling center. And so what happens, and this is a model that we have at the University of Denver that works really well, is that we have one office on campus that gets all these reports from all over campus of somebody, let's say, seeing somebody struggle and they don't know what to do, right? And so they send a report that could be anonymous or not and say, hey, I noticed this one person is really struggling. Can somebody check in on them? We get these reports and then we can reach out to the student and be like, hey, are you okay? Like, what's going on? Type of thing. And this has been very, very helpful for students, right? Because sometimes going back to the stigma around mental health needs is that the student might not come to us and might not say that. And so when they find somebody reaching out to them, they feel cared for and they feel like, okay, I don't have to put the effort in, like somebody already reached out to me. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is really the holistic approach that Nathan was talking about earlier, of really recognizing that the student is a full human being with a lot of needs, right? And so again, the model that we have at the Counseling Center at the University of Denver is that we are an interdisciplinary team, meaning that we have physicians, we have psychiatrists, we have nurse practitioners, we have dietitians. We used to have somebody to do like emotional support, animal assistance, that kind of thing. And so we're really trying to figure out, okay, like what is it that what are the students needing that we're not fulfilling? Because we recognize that our role is limited as well. So The other part of that is we recognize that not everyone's going to be able to pick up on signs that maybe we as mental health professionals can see. So the educational part of our job is really important, right? So we go out to different departments on campus, especially maybe departments who've had recurring issues with students or deal with students in a different capacity than we do, and provide education about things pretty basic, right? Like stress, like signs of stress, signs maybe that somebody is feeling really anxious and the anxiety is taking a toll on their functioning and things like that. And so we provide the education while emphasizing that they're not the professionals. And so if the signs reach a certain limit, please reach out to us and we'll intervene.
This last year and a half has been unprecedented in many ways, of course. As this pandemic continues, that's caused all types of mental health issues, and of course that's for the population at large. But also at the same time, there was something about, I think, the isolation and the crisis that we know that issues of racial justice go to the founding of this republic, but it seemed as if the attention that issues around racial justice received over this pandemic has been unprecedented. Looking at, of course, the reaction of so many to the killing of George Floyd and other African Americans, and even the killing of those of Asian descent in the Atlanta area, a little while ago. And so I was wondering if, and I'll ask Nathan this question, and then I'm going to ask Nahed and Amy to jump in. What are some of the unique challenges that you have seen from a mental health perspective, given what is happening right now with COVID-19 and this, I would say, flashpoint of intense focus on racial justice issues? Nathan.
It's a great question, and like with any human behaviors and reactions, they're complex and very multifaceted. But at a high level, and just to contextualize where this answer is coming from, we developed a tool called You at College that's at 180 campuses across the nation. So we get a lot of student data related to their mental health and well-being, and have a lot of touch points, of course, with champions at each of these 180 campuses. But in terms of the first part of that, one thing that we know, we can be very responsive and make sure that we are uploading content and resources related to all the challenges that you're speaking to. Specifically last summer, we had a wealth of content and resources and wellness tips and coping mechanisms that we uploaded to our sites that were by far our most viewed pieces of resources throughout the course of the last year. And it goes to show that young people, I would argue the majority of our culture, but young people especially, are very tuned in to issues of equality and DEI, which is such a great strength of this generation. But the other side of that is when we have our media and social media that is this constant 24/7 churning of messaging that's reminding us of all the injustices and atrocious acts that do happen, that without a doubt can and often does impact vicarious trauma. I know for myself, I don't look at the news before going to bed every night because unfortunately the news just reminds me and riles me up. And then I have a really poor night's sleep. And in the absence of being able to convey those messages and reminding students that you have to find the balance of being proactive and fighting for your cause while also taking care of yourself, unfortunately, it can be very easy to be fully consumed by this, increasing our anxiety or depression or any other symptoms that we're coping with as individuals. I have a whole bunch of other things I can say, but I don't want to steal the mic, so I'm happy to pass it along.
Yeah, and I had Amy, I was wondering if you had any thoughts with regards to what is unique. It feels like we're in a unique time of stress. How is that manifesting among the students that you see, the students that you work with? I'll ask Amy or Nahed if you want to jump in on that.
So I think that one of the biggest things that we're seeing is the level of activism by our students. And, at Active Minds, we focus a lot on policy change and what can campuses do to create environments that are more inclusive. And what we're really seeing from our students is this idea of making changes on campus that resonate for diverse individuals or people with intersectional identities, and ensuring that they're meeting with campus leadership, showing their dissatisfaction with strategies that institutions are using, and vocalizing how they want long-lasting systemic change versus just a Band-Aid on a situation. So we've seen that across many campuses related to a lot of the systemic injustices. I echo what Nathan was saying. Our students are so connected to each other, to the news media. They have a pretty strong pulse of what's going on. So one thing that I always recommend to any sort of leadership at institution is, how are you inviting the student voice into whatever you're planning or programs? How are we asking our students what they need, rather than just assuming that we should be doing something, right? Are our students not using counseling services because the counselors in the counseling center don't represent the identities that they hold? Are students not engaging in self-care because sometimes that can come from a place of privilege? And what does it look like on a campus if you're struggling with your basic needs? What supports do campuses have, whether it's housing or food security, that we can do to address these, so then they can start addressing some of their mental health concerns? And so I think institutions, when you bring in students to tell you, rather than waiting for students to move forward with some idea, we tend to have better, more student-centered, campus-centered solutions to work towards some of these institutional struggles and systems of oppression that maybe we wouldn't have the same solutions if we didn't bring them in.
Yeah, it's been really hard, just the pandemic and the real, I think, national recognition of systemic oppression. It's not new, right? But I think it's just been in the media more. What we've noticed, especially with the murder of George Floyd, is that that coincided with our finals time during that quarter, because we're on a quarter system, and our students were really, really struggling for two reasons. One is that they couldn't disconnect, right? You cannot remove this part of your identity from your reality. And so they were really invested, really wanted to know. And at the same time, they're still students and they have finals. So they, at the times when they were like, okay, I'm going to protect myself and turn off the news, they felt really guilty about doing that, because they felt that that was a form of privilege that, that they can disconnect and kind of move away from that. And so we did a couple of things, and I think this is really important to recognize, is this idea of the system that Amy was talking about, right? Part of it is that we do want to hear from the students about what they need, but we also want to try to advocate with the students, not for the students, right? To go out, to connect with other administrators and talk about, okay, how can we help this situation? This may be temporary for now, and this is a longer term goal that we need to focus on, but for now, what are we going to do to help out with that? And so part of it is a systems issue of, okay, do we need easier deadlines, or maybe just more flexible deadlines for finals or exams or things like that? And also working with the students from a mental health perspective around prioritization, right? And kind of understanding that just because you're choosing yourself in one specific moment doesn't mean that you're ignoring the cause or that you don't care or anything like that. So it's this idea of prioritization, because it's really important. You can't do it all, right? And I think that in a traditional age, college students, they usually want to do everything and want to take over the world, and it's great, and it's also not realistic, right? So kind of trying to adjust the expectations a little bit.
I had actually a question that I would like to pose. And at this point, first of all, I want to thank the audience. We had some questions that came in advance, and in about 15 minutes, I'll probably kick it to some the live Q&A. But one of the questions that came in advance, and I want to ask the head to see if you can answer this. A question that came in was, how is mental illness manifested differently among minority college students compared to white students? What is the difference if we talk about specifically underrepresented minority students? What are the different stresses, the different challenges, and how does illness manifest differently from minority students as opposed to the general population?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really depends on what population exactly that we're talking about. But I would say that one thing that we've been seeing across is manifestation in sleep difficulties. That's kind of the one thing that really shows up, is that students really have a hard time sleeping. Part of it is, kind of what Nathan was saying, is just the constant messaging about things that are going on, but also just this idea that, they're kind of trying to problem solve as they're sleeping, or as they're trying to sleep and kind of like shutting their brain off for the night or something. So, the thing to be careful about in pathologizing these symptoms is that we need to understand that the field of psychology was based on a very white-centric view of the world. And so when we're treating students of color, we really need to keep in mind, first of all, cultural practices, any cultural understandings of, human functioning and things like that. And so, something that oftentimes will come up is people thinking that, a student is being superstitious or like kind of doing something and that's weird, and pathologizing that. But you also have to have a cultural lens to understand that maybe this is part of the student's culture, and this is something, or maybe part of their religious beliefs or understanding of the world. And so I don't know that I have a very specific answer for your question, but I think that mostly with students of color, especially on predominantly white institutions, their mental health will manifest more as somatic symptoms, like physical symptoms more, right? So it could be stomach aches, it could be difficulty sleeping, it could be, excessive sweating, shaking, difficulty with eating, things like that. Because again, there has been a consistent history of stigmatizing mental health issues. And so it's like, no, it can't be that. And I'm not going to think about it. And so it comes up physically, usually.
No, I'd be happy to,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be happy to add a little bit. First off, Nahed, very well put across the board. The one thing I would add is that different cultural groups have different expectations and stigma related to mental health. So when you look at, if anyone wants to, you can go to the Healthy Minds database and actually look at their tens of thousands of responses nationwide, and you can see and break down by race and ethnicity who has access to therapy in the past year. And as Nahed has mentioned, rates of individuals who identify as white are much higher than many minority populations. Speaking to that data, folks who identify as Asian or from Asian backgrounds tend to experience the highest stigma as related to mental health treatment seeking. And interestingly, in that Healthy Minds data set, you can also see very quickly, when you look at experiences of discrimination, you can see that various groups are experiencing much higher levels of discrimination than individuals who phenotypically and identify as white. So with that, of course, there's increased needs, but then the challenge is, how do we make sure we're offering a spectrum of services with the acknowledgement that traditional one-on therapy is conceptualized and normalized in very much of a white culture? So how do we make sure that there are more communal opportunities? Are there peer-to-peer groups that we can be offering? Again, confidential and digital supports where students don't feel like they're disclosing something that's highly stigmatized can be a great first step in getting that support. And a couple of questions have come in of, how do we do this and how do we change that? And I'll just very quickly allude to it now, but we need to elevate well-being and mental health to being a topic that's just as important as your grades in getting a diploma. And when we have our learning management systems and we don't include anything related to mental health, well, that's where all of our students are going, regardless of identity status. So we need to elevate these messages to normalize both that, hey, you're not alone in experiencing X, Y, or Z, and B, it's very normal and we have supports on campus to help you cope.
You know, there are a couple of questions that came in with regards to law enforcement. As we know, in the society at large, there's been quite a bit of concern expressed that oftentimes police are called in to deal with issues with regards to a mental health crisis. And so the question is, are they equipped properly? Were they told in advance that this is a mental health concern? And so a lot of the concern, even the violence that has happened, really the concern is that an appropriate response was not offered because the policeman or woman may not have been equipped to deal with the problem. When it comes to a higher ed campus, one of the questions that was asked, I'm going to ask this to Amy, is how do institutions navigate safety welfare checks by public safety, campus police on students of color, given all of the issues that we see broadly? How can colleges best work with public safety and their own police to make sure that their response to mental health crises is appropriate? Amy, I was wondering if you could address that question.
Yeah, so, going back to what Nathan was just saying about elevating student well-being, when we think about doing that, it's not just with faculty and staff members, right? It's across the full student experience. And so what we've seen on quite a few campuses over the past year is this idea of how are we training our campus safety officers to understand mental health needs, but also what's the level of cultural competency training that we're providing to these officers, knowing sometimes they're the first line of defense and wanting to make sure that they're, approaching situations, especially mental health crises, in an appropriate manner. Other things that we're seeing campuses do are actually having trained behavioral interventionists be the first line of defense, right? So rather than sending in a law enforcement officer, right, as you were saying, David, which can automatically elicit some sort of very strong reaction, is there someone who's trained in mental health, who is not a law enforcement officer, who can go in and do a mental health assessment, who can help the person that they're working with explore all of the options, whether it's, some sort of inpatient treatment, if there's some sort of involuntary hospitalization that the person needs to go through during mental health crises. And one of the nice things about, Nahid was saying, college campuses are a village, is that there's opportunity on campuses to try some of these innovative strategies, right? So we might struggle elevating that into communities, but on a college campus, it's very realistic to have someone from the university's behavioral intervention team or the counseling center to either go with the law enforcement officer and they be doing the initial interaction in order to, reduce any level of anxiety or tension that comes just from having law enforcement present. I'd love to turn it over to Nathan and Nahid if they have any other thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you got it.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just going to make another comment about, the involuntary hospitalizations. This is a situation that we unfortunately find ourselves in quite a bit. I think the most important thing to remember is my role as a gatekeeper, right? Sometimes there are systemic issues that I have no control over, like calling 911 and asking for an ambulance, but getting police officers instead. This has been happening, I think, because of labor shortages and just other things going on right now. But it is my role as a gatekeeper to really advocate for my client, my student, and be like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not sending my student with you, especially if it's a student of color, to really be mindful of the mental health impact that is going to have. And then what, like Amy was saying, is also just educating other campus departments and campus offices around, okay, well, if that happens, please call us. We have crisis services as well, and you can call us and we can come help you, because again, this is our expertise. This is not something that you have to deal with, or, please walk them to the counseling center or something like that. But I think it's really important to kind of be a barrier between the students and law enforcement, because if you let that contact happen, sometimes it's not going to go well. And I don't want that. I don't want a student to have come to the counseling center seeking help and then end up being punished because I'm not doing my job.
Yeah, great points all around. I'll be very brief, but I think this really stems from the challenge of elevating the concerns and downstream impacts of not elevating mental health across our universities. Right now, we're at a time where we have the opportunity, and the data is clearly speaking to the need to provide adequate training for faculty, staff, and especially anyone who does have power over students, whether that's coaches, professors, faculty members, especially with grad school, big research grants, and of course, emergency responders. And now is the time to act. And in my experience with our 180 campuses, we see some that are very progressive, and we see some that, in my opinion, could very much use some work in progress on this front.
Nahed, I'm going to ask you this question, and perhaps Nathan and Amy can jump in as well. One question that came in earlier was with regards to, I think, cultural barriers with regards to stigmas attached with seeking out mental health care, stigmas attached to going to counseling, stigmas attached with medication. One question that came in specifically is, how do institutions help overcome, for instance, Hispanic familial barriers, cultural barriers to not seek out help when you need it? So how does, and this question is with regard to Hispanic culture, but it could go to others. How do you overcome cultural barriers to seeking out mental health care and or taking medication that could be necessary given what a student's going through?
Yeah, it's something that's certainly still a work in progress. It's something we're still trying to figure out. But I think the main thing is to really normalize how mental health issues do not have to be only severe mental health issues, right? It could be day-to-day stuff where you can kind of come and talk about things with anybody. So like I said at the very beginning, part of it is going out to the students. So a big part is doing outreach, seeing where the students are and going and having very casual conversations just about how they're doing and how things are going on, and maybe providing some education along the way of, yeah, sometimes when people are adjusting to college life, this is kind of what they experience, and really kind of trying to normalize this conversation so that students start to think, oh, you know what, I am experiencing this. Maybe I could talk to somebody about it, right? And I think it really is helpful to have a demographic at counseling centers that maybe reflects those populations a little bit, which again is a struggle, right? This is a predominantly white field, unfortunately. And oftentimes students, if they don't see somebody that looks like them or maybe could potentially understand their experience, they really worry about that, right? Because the other thing to consider is that therapy can be very individualistic, and that's not going to work for cultures like Hispanic cultures, right? Where it's more collectivist society and you take yourself and your needs out of the equation a little bit for the greater good. And so we have to be really careful about how we're presenting that, right? Because when we are trying to tell students, yes, working on your mental health is important and we really need you to take care of that, we have to understand that in the larger context of how that's going to impact their family. We can't be like, yes, you have to be selfish, like go take care of your needs. That's just not going to work, right? And so I think having cultural humility and cultural understanding of different issues that are going to impact different populations is going to be helpful. So I would say outreach, more diverse hires, and retaining of staff of color. But also, sometimes it doesn't have to be that official or that serious. Sometimes, there could be let's say like a Black Student Association meeting, and I'll just show up to the meeting and just hang out with the students. I don't have to talk about mental health issues necessarily, but I think it's really important to establish that connection of, in case the student one day is like, I really feel like I need to talk to somebody, and they're like, oh, I saw Nahed one day, I know her, I'm gonna go talk to her, right? So just kind of presenting ourselves in other areas outside of the counseling center and really being around campus, I think is helpful. And, showing up to classrooms and things like that to talk about other issues that the students may be facing.
Another area too is just the power of peers when we understand cultural stigmas and reasons for not seeking professional help. And so, at Active Minds, one thing that we really know really well is that students connect to other students, and those are their experts. So, maybe Nahed goes to a Black Student Union meeting and someone comes to see her in counseling, and then they could share that experience with their friends. And it goes to the idea of normalizing seeking professional help from people with similar identities or friends or in your same peer group, to make it so it's more accepted. And then really sharing stories. And so when campuses think about inviting in speakers to talk about mental health, making sure that they are, representative of the group that they're talking to, or how can we have diverse representation there to talk about some of these cultural stigmas, right? Especially if you're working on increasing the number of students with diverse identities in counseling, right? So one of the first steps is addressing those stigmas, but also having students aren't going to seek professional help unless they know that there's a space that's safe. And then the last thing I would say about this is making sure that there's resources tailored to those students, right? So it's really difficult to have students go into counseling, but the resources aren't made for them. I commend Nathan and you at college for really providing tailored experiences for students who are using that. They have content written by students. It's engaging for students. And when maybe you're a Hispanic student, right? And you are understanding the different cultural levels, or Hispanic male student, right? And the levels of masculinity in that culture. I'm starting to break down some of those pieces by peers who can understand is really instrumental in reducing stigma and encouraging professional help seeking.
Yeah, I'll add one thing. First off, Amy, just to back your statement up with a little bit of data, one thing that is very validating for us is when we do have students who endorse being of a minority status, we do see that personalized content, whether it be related to stigma or help seeking, being by far the most viewed content by that specific demographic. So we as institutions, in my opinion, can't just be relying on general messaging working for everyone. We need to really tailor our messaging to break down the barriers experienced by different minority groups. And just to build upon that a little bit, I really appreciate both of your points related to sort of shifting the culture, but I also think it's very important to think of the physical barriers that exist for many students. From the spring 2020 to the fall of 2020, we saw about a 23% decrease in overall therapeutic services. And the majority of that decrease was actually from students who identify as BIPOC. And when we peel the layers of the onion back, if I'm a student and I am from a culture that is not supportive of one-on-one therapy, all of a sudden I'm in quarantine at home with my parents, that all of a sudden becomes very difficult for me to engage in a health appointment because I don't have a private space with which to do so. Maybe I don't have reliable internet. We have to make sure that we're taking these larger systemic barriers into consideration, because that's not something that most of us from majority cultures are thinking about on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, at this time, I want to kick it over to live Q&A. I thank all of our audience members who have asked questions, and I will encourage you to go ahead and utilize the question function to send in your questions. But there's what I want to start with, Nathan. I think you had mentioned that you would like to answer, and I think you might have already touched on this, but I want to pose it in full to see if you had any other thoughts, and if any of our other panelists had any thoughts. One of the questions came from some member of the audience who said, just because I work in student success, academic support, doesn't mean I shouldn't also be helping the student with other aspects of their college experience in addition to the academic support, i.e. their life issues. The question is, how do we discourage working in silos and having all offices, staff look at students holistically? Whose responsibility is it, Nathan, when it comes to mental health crises? And how do institutions foster, I would say, a collective holistic approach to identifying crises and seeking to be proactive in responding to them rather than people passing the buck and throwing on the ball and balls being dropped? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, if you can.
I'd be happy to. Joanne, thank you so much for the question. And I know a couple other anonymous attendees asked something along those similar lines. So first off, we need to move mental health out of the confines of the counseling center and health promotion. We know that those two offices, even on the best of campuses, can reach about 15 to maybe 20% of a student body. And Nahed, I think you can relate to this, but most counseling centers are in like the basement of the southernmost building on campus. They're not highly visible. They don't, like, most people don't want to go there, which is a whole nother conversation on its own. But we all need to take a part in this, just like we would all identify a student who is having an asthma attack in the moment. We need to make sure that faculty, staff, dining hall workers, everyone on campus has basic mental health literacy training. So you don't have to have all the answers, but if I have some very simple verbiage that can say, hey, Nahed, I've noticed you haven't been yourself recently. I know a lot's going on. I wonder if it'd be beneficial to connect with someone at the counseling center to support that. That training does not take 7 days to do. It can be a very low investment. There's ways to do it in person with Train the Trainer. There's ways to do it digitally, or being able to provide a tool like you at college where you could simply just refer a student and say, check this out, I think you'll benefit. But we have to get it out of just the counseling center, because the reality is academic advisors are dealing with more and more mental health. Even though they're not signing up for it, it is coming in through their doors. When I'm talking about what I'm going to do after graduation in a very difficult economy, that is bleeding over into some significant anxiety and stress. And then you add in other DEI and the consistent racial trauma that we're experiencing. We all have to be ready to go on this front or be able to make those referrals. I have other thoughts, but I'd love to pass it around.
I'd love to jump in here and support that idea of, making appropriate referrals and starting to think less about students being in crisis and more, what can we do from the time a student is even thinking about enrolling in our campus to when, after they graduate and they become alums, to how do we support them and their mental health. So one thing we have at Active Minds is our Validate, Appreciate, and Refer training. And it's that 30-minute training really for anyone on campus. And students actually came up with this program. And so it can be peer-to-peer, it can be a faculty member, but really it's, when talking to someone or having that question that Nathan just said, like, Nahed, it seems like you're having a rough time. How are you doing? But meaning, how are you doing? And not just brushing off that it's fine. And when someone shares with you how they're doing, you're validating their experience and then appreciating the fact that it can be hard to ask for help, or especially for our students these days, essentially identifying an area where they aren't thriving, and then making appropriate referrals. So having everyone on campus know the places where you can refer students to, but also the same culture across campus, whether you are, like Nathan was saying, a faculty member or a cafeteria worker, where everyone on campus can have that conversation. And they have the tools to understand that when you're having this conversation, you don't have to be a clinician. Just by having a conversation doesn't mean you're going to fix or rectify this. But you are providing the student with the resources that they need and the support, which sometimes that's what students need. They just need someone to listen to them, to help them navigate this difficult time.
There's another question that came in, and I want to pose it to Nahed along related lines. one question was asked, and I'm going to ask the head to respond, and others can join in as well. If you could speak on mentorships between students of color and faculty staff of color. It could be that students of color specifically who have the most need may not go to the counseling center, but they're going to their advisor. They're going to people who may not have a counseling background for counseling, right? How can institutions, knowing that this is a reality, help equip, I would say, faculty, advisors, those without a counseling background to actually step into that gap when students will come to them in crisis on ahead?
Yeah, I think this is related to what Nathan said earlier about we need to kind of expand this knowledge about counseling for across campus, right? And you don't have to be a counselor, but you can rely on the relationship, right? I would assume that if a student of color comes to a faculty of color or staff of color, there's already some sort of established relationship there that enables the student to feel comfortable enough to open up. So I think it's really important to just be human and really see what's going on, because I think what often happens, especially on predominantly white institutions, is that the students feel very lost and they start feeling like they're behind their peers in terms of where they're going, what they're doing, right? Because they're getting all these maybe indirect or informal mentorship tips from other faculty that look like them or other staff that look like them, when the students of color may not have the same experience. And so they start internalizing that, like, what is wrong with me? Why am I not doing that? So I think that relying on the relationship